We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I think nature's imagination is so much greater than man's. She's never gonna let us relax.
We live in an in-between universe where things change alright, but according to patterns, rules, or as we call them, laws of nature.
I'm this guy standing on a planet. Really, I'm just a speck compared with a star. The planet is just another speck. To think about all of this, to think about the vast emptiness of space, billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of specks. The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Across the sea of space, the stars are others, and we've traveled this way before, and there is much to be learned.
We're all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically.
I find it elevating and exhilarating to discover that we live in a universe which permits the evolution of molecular machines as intricate and subtle as we.
I know that the molecules in my body are traceable to phenomena in the cosmos. That makes me want to grab people in the street and say, have you heard this?
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. There's this tremendous mass of waves all over in space, which is the light bouncing around the room, going from one thing to the other, and it's all really there, really there. But you gotta stop and think about it, about the complexity, to really get the pleasure. It's all really there, really there. The inconceivable nature. To think about all of this, to think about the vast emptiness of space, billions and billions of stars, billions and billions of specks. The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together. The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Across the sea of space, the stars are others, and we've traveled this way before, and there is much to be learned.
That was the Talking Alternative Radio Encore broadcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Now, for the live shows, professionals serving community, talkingalternative.com.
Good evening. Welcome to Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sauber. I'm an employment law and business law attorney and founder of the law offices of Eric M. Sauber. And I host this show, Employment Law Today, each Tuesday evening, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we address different issues that many small and mid-sized business owners are facing today, issues regarding and related to employment, issues related to labor, issues related to business, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of how the pandemic may have impacted certain topics for employers and employees alike. And so usually in this spirit, I have a guest on my show every week. I select people who are well-versed in the topic we speak about, whether it's about business or recruiting or employee relations. And lately, in light of all of the COVID-19 regulations and rules that employers have to face, rules regarding issues of mandatory vaccines and mask mandates, or reasonable accommodations, or safe workplaces, I decided to do something a little bit different tonight. I thought I would have an employment law attorney who's well-versed in this area. And since this is in fact what I do with a passion every day of my work week, I thought I would just give a presentation to my audience, and I gathered some questions in advance to focus on some topics. So with that backdrop, our topic tonight will be COVID considerations for employers, what you need to know about bringing workers back to the office. And so my guest, of course, would be myself, Eric Sauber. As I mentioned, I'm an employment law, business law attorney. Just some brief background about me. I've been practicing law since January 1999 and have had my practice since the spring of 2001. So my focus has been mainly on issues of employment labor law. And what we're seeing in my field these days, we are seeing a lot of questions and changes and policies that are coming up that employers need to know about. So with that backdrop, let's take a bit of a roadmap of our show tonight. Let's give a roadmap here. We've got the COVID-19 Relief HERO Act. We're going to talk about some rules regarding workplace safety as per the COVID-19 pandemic when your employee is coming back to the office. We'll talk about what you as an employer can and cannot do when it comes to having a mandatory vaccination policy for your workers. And we'll talk about what you might have to do if you're an employer with more than 100 employees. So I'm going to start with those employers working in and having workplaces in New York State, right? We're going to talk about a safe workplace under New York State law. All right, so the first law we're going to speak about is the COVID Relief HERO Act. The HERO Act stands for Health and Essential Rights, is the main crux of the law. It was signed into law, just for some background here, in New York State. It's a New York State law, signed in the spring of 2021. And what it basically does is it requires you as an employer to have certain new workplace health and safety protections, certain safety protocols in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what the New York HERO Act requires is basically it requires employers in private industry across New York State and with New York State work sites to have an infectious airborne disease outbreak policy. So basically New York State saying, look, if you're an employer, you have employees coming to the office or the work site, you need policies in place, you need a plan, and you need to tell your employees about this plan that protects them from exposure to certain airborne infectious diseases. And we're not talking about the common cold here, we're talking about very serious diseases that are easy to communicate, such as COVID-19, which is one disease covered by this act. So basically think of it as if you have employees on the work site, you need to, let's talk about what you need to do, right? You have until, well, August 5th was the deadline to adopt a plan, a safety plan that basically says what your policies are around things such as social distancing, masking, mask mandates, contact tracing, all these things must be a plan that you have for your employees if you're a New York State company or a company from out of state with workers at a New York State work site. So it's interesting in that this is, think of it as a heightened safety standard that you as an employer must have. And New York State was smart about this, I think, because a lot of employers don't know what the safety plan looks like. How do you make one? What is considered, what passes the test, what passes the standard, right? Who decides if your safety plan as an employer meets the proper requirements of you and keeps your workers safe? So these are some of the questions that the state addressed in this New York HERO Act, in this law. And basically, if you're an employer, here's what you need to know. And here's what you're required to do. You have to provide a copy of this safety plan for stopping the spread of certain diseases such as COVID, right? You have to give that to New York State and to your employees. So you have about 30 days after you adopt a plan, right, to post it in a prominent location in your work site and to give a copy to all of your employees. Now it's interesting because the plan doesn't speak about vaccination as required under the New York HERO Act. A lot of employers have asked me questions. I got some questions before the show about what happens if I'm hesitant to put a vaccination policy in place. I have less than 100 employees and I'm not sure if I want to go that route. Well, the New York HERO Act does not say you have to do that. However, if you chose a mandatory vaccination policy, you would certainly be considered, you can certainly consider that rather, and put that as part of your HERO Act, your safety plan. So just keep in mind that this are takeaways here, that this is a plan for safety. New York State Department of Labor has excellent protocols you can download and follow. And you distribute it to your employees and you add it to your employee handbook. And the plan goes into effect as of this fall. And so it's just one thing to keep on your radar. Some questions I've gotten about this are questions from clients, from colleagues, even from people watching the show, about whether or not the plan must be, whether or not the employees rather have a say in the plan. And to answer that question, if you have 10 or more employees, then you as an employer have to create a joint workforce, sort of a committee that's made up of your employees who are volunteer for this or are selected, and made up of the employer. And they're basically management and workers. And they get to oversee the safety plan that you have in place. And this might sound a little dry to some people, and that if it is kind of dry, I recommend reaching out to an employment lawyer such as myself to help guide you through this situation, through this creating this plan that you will need in New York State under the New York HERO Act. And it's important too because the state does provide for some penalties, if you violate this law. For example, you as a company can be fined up to $10,000 for violations of either not having a proper safety plan for your employees or not distributing it to your employees. That's a big mistake a lot of employers make. They don't send a copy to their employees in their native language and in English as well. And you can also get daily penalties starting at $50 per day. So it's a good law to know about. It's good to have on your radar. It's good to be aware of. And it's also good to know that this law applies if you have workers in a workplace. So if you're a company that has decided to go 100% remote and your workers are working from their homes, their apartments, Starbucks for all you know, then this law isn't really applying to you. Because when you think about it, unless you have any workers in the workplace, it's about stopping the spread of an infectious airborne disease. And so if your employees are working in their own homes miles away from each other, the chance of spreading this disease at work is pretty minimal, if not impossible, unless some new science comes out that says to the contrary, which I highly doubt. So that's a little something on the New York HERO Act, people to know about. And OSHA is on the federal level. OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Act. It's also the Occupational Safety and Health Agency. OSHA is an agency and a law. And OSHA has its own federal version of certain that makes you as an employer obligated to have a safe workplace, right? So you have standards around preventing outbreaks of infectious diseases, standards around safety in the workplace in terms of like the materials that you use, in terms of what dangers workers are exposed to, what kind of protective gear they have. So all of this is something to keep in mind. The point of this takeaway is that New York State and the federal government both have laws that require you, especially in the time of COVID-19, to up your game when it comes to protecting your workers and their safety. And so I think it's an important point to make on your radar. Okay, and it's a little different, as I mentioned, format this week since we don't have a guest on the show. It's just more of an important presentation on issues that I think we all need to know about. So the next issue I'll just dive into a little bit, and then I'll stop for a commercial break, is the issue of state mandates, right? State mandatory vaccines or state mask mandates. So New York State is a little bit different in terms of what it requires when you compare it, let's say, to the federal government, right? Many people, I'm sure, watching tonight have perhaps read about in the news, or perhaps maybe you saw President Biden's televised press conference where he mentioned a new executive order, a new rule going out regarding mandatory vaccines. I'm going to start with New York State in terms of what's required for an employer, right? What measures can you take and what are you not allowed to do when it comes to state mandates for vaccines and for masks? Actually, but first I'm going to take a brief commercial break. I think it's a nice breaking point, perhaps, now that we covered one of the main state laws around having a healthy and safe workplace. So I'm going to just say for now that you're watching Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sauber. I'm an employment law business law attorney, and I'm on Talk Radio NYC right now and every Tuesday at 5 p.m. So stick around. We'll come back and talk about state mandates for vaccines and other important issues that you really need to know about. We'll be right back.
Are you a business owner? Do you want to be a business owner? Do you work with business owners? Hi, I'm Stephen Fry, your small and medium-sized business or SMB guy, and I'm the host of the new show, Always Friday. While I love to have fun on my show, we take those Friday feelings of freedom and clarity to discuss popular topics on the minds of SMBs today. Please join me and my various special guests on Friday at 11 a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant. And on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays, 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you interested in having a better relationship with yourself, others, and God? Greetings. I'm your host, Dr. George Andow, for the show, A Journey Through into Awareness. On my show, we journey into the awareness that the mind of God is the true seat of our personal consciousness. We join together each Monday at 7 p.m., so tune in on Talk Radio NYC.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sauber. As mentioned, I'm an employment law business law attorney, and I host this show every week where we discuss the most pressing and hottest employment and business law issues and topics. And so tonight, I'm talking about a topic that's been on a lot of people's minds. If you're an employer, frankly, in any state, especially in New York, but anywhere, if you're an employee even, you may have some questions about what you as an employer can do in terms of requiring vaccinations in the workplace or requiring masks. I think this is a very important point that employers now are struggling with. What's required, what can they do, what can't they do, what are they forced to do under the law? So I'm going to talk about that. Let's start with New York State. What are some of the New York State mandates around vaccines or masks? Well, if you're a state employee of New York, and this might apply to somebody listening here this evening, New York has the latest requirement that state employees get vaccinated. They're going to vaccinate, I should say, from the COVID-19 virus. And they're going to delay that for a bit until October 12th. And they're going to state that at that point, employees can either get vaccinated for COVID-19, or rather must get vaccinated for COVID-19, or they must submit to undergo weekly testing by more than a month from now, weekly tests to see if they're negative for COVID-19. So basically, there's some state laws in New York State that are broadening mask mandates as well for vaccinated workers, right? So now state workers have to wear their masks in safe facilities. And if you're a private company, let's say you have a New York State agency as a client, keep in mind that if your employees will be on their premises in their facilities, then they must comply with any mask mandates that the state has. The same mask mandates the state might have for its state employees may apply to your private company if you're doing work for a New York State entity or agency. We'll talk a bit about returning to work as well. And employers have a right to keep, you as an employer have a right to keep a safe workplace. And in fact, you're required to. I think one of the catch-22s that many employers are finding themselves in today, a bind, is that they don't want to get sued by their employees for any dangerous condition of property or for, let's say, not having a safe workplace where people can contract COVID-19. There have been some cases of companies being sued for not having enough safety protocols in place. But if a company is too stringent about, say, requiring vaccinations, and that company is not aware of some of the exemptions and how to handle those exemptions, then it could be a sticky lawsuit on the other side of that equation. So a lot of employers right now, if you're an employer, business owner, you might be feeling sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so what are your rights to require your workers to wear masks or to get vaccinated? I'm going to take the vaccination issue first. So you might own a restaurant, you might own an accounting firm, you might own a construction company. You as an employer might have all kinds of different businesses. And if you have less than 100 employees, you're not required to have a mandatory vaccination policy. But suppose you want to. Suppose you want to keep yourself safe, keep your loved ones safe, keep your employees safe. You might get some pushback, right? Anyone who reads the news today is seeing how much pushback there is over mask mandates or vaccination mandates, right? There have been a lot of lawsuits from healthcare workers and nurses unions and from the hospital workers and from just general accounting firms. People are suing their employers saying, you can't require me to wear a mask, or you can't require me to get a vaccine of COVID-19 vaccine. So we'll talk about the COVID-19 vaccination. And the good news is that if you're an employer, you have a right to mandate that your employees get the COVID-19 vaccination to come to work. It's not 100% absolute right in that if your employees, let's say, claim a religious exemption, right? That to say your worker comes to you and says, hey boss, I can't get the vaccine, or I won't get the vaccine for COVID-19 because I have a firm religious held belief. It's against my religious practices. It's against my religious worship, my principles. So I don't want to get the COVID-19 vaccine, but I still want to come to work. So what do you do in that situation if you're an employer? Well, I've seen some not so good advice out there, to be honest. I've seen people telling employers that, once the worker raises a religious objection to the vaccine, or a disability-based objection to the vaccine, I've seen people wrongly tell employers and business owners that you then have to let them come to work without the vaccine. So you're running a restaurant, your head chef says, I have a religious objection, I'm a Jehovah's Witness, I'm another religion that doesn't agree with vaccines, so I'm not going to get the vaccine, I'm coming to work on Tuesday. A lot of employers have thought that their hands are tied. Well, they mentioned religion, I don't want to be sued for discrimination, I guess I have to just say, okay, right? And actually, that's not true. You have a right to, well, there are a couple of things you can do as an employer. Let's take the religious exemption as the first example. Employee comes to you, it says, I don't want to get the vaccine, it's against my religious beliefs. So first off, you have a right to examine whether or not they actually can do their job without the vaccine. So it goes into this it's called a reasonable accommodation request. It's looked at that way, the same way you look at it if you have, let's say, a worker who can't work on the Sabbath because of religious objection, right? Can you reasonably accommodate that worker's religion without hurting yourself as a company? So what does that mean? It means, can you put that worker, let's say, in another position possibly, that where they won't be perhaps endangering other people around them, but they can also get their job done? So let's take some concrete examples, right? And we'll take it step by step. I'll take the example of, let's say, a daycare center, right? A daycare facility in New York, New Jersey, and suppose one of the daycare workers, the teachers or the people who take care of the small children, comes to you and says, I don't want to get the vaccine, it's against my religion. What do you do? Well, under a reasonable accommodation analysis, you have to ask yourself, okay, is this person's request going to hurt my business, right? Is it going to pose an undue hardship? Meaning, is it going to hurt me as a business owner financially, right? Their request is, let's say, is so out there that I not afford to meet the request. Is their request to still work for you and not get the vaccine going to be logistically impossible, right? You can't operate. It'll throw a wrench in the monkey works and you can't do what you do as a company. Will the issue is your employee who is telling you, hey boss, I don't want to get the COVID-19 vaccine, it's against my religious beliefs, I want to come back to work in whatever company you own. And the question is that going to be impossible to carry out? So I'll give some examples, some concrete ones, might make it easier. With, say, the daycare agency, if the daycare worker says, I don't want to get the vaccine, but I still want to do my job. Well, question becomes, how can you accommodate them? Meaning, can they still do their job without coming in? Now, if their job is they're the bookkeeper for the daycare center, or maybe they answer the phones, that's the job that arguably they can do remotely. Maybe it's not going to hurt your daycare center because you're an employer, you run this operation. And maybe they can do their job from home in their basement or wherever they are, at a Starbucks. It's not going to hurt you, right? You get your work on time. They send a spreadsheet, an email, Google Dropbox and share files, and it's fine. But suppose that worker's main job is to take care of the children, right? To change their diapers, to play with them, to feed them snacks. That's very close contact. That is not a job that you can accommodate by saying, okay, don't get the vaccine because of your religion. I'm going to accommodate you by having you work from home, right? You can't zoom in to change a diaper. You just can't. Can that worker perhaps maybe be siloed off to doing a different duty? Well, if they're in charge of a class of small children, maybe toddler age, let's say, then New York State has very strict guidelines that say that each daycare agency has to have a certain number of teachers or workers per child. So you might not be able to accommodate that request on an operations basis. Hey, I'm sorry, Susan, I know you want to work off to the side here, but I need you to watch the children and I need you to interact with them. And then do you have a compelling reason to deny, pardon me, the accommodation request? Right, that's the big part of this equation. If your children in this daycare center, the people whose parents pay you to send their children there, these kids can't be vaccinated, right? So if they catch COVID-19, they can get sick, they can get very sick, and they can cause the agency or the daycare center to close down, to be quarantined for weeks or even months on end. It can be a very messy situation. So you have a compelling interest in saying, no, I'm sorry, you either come to work or I have to let you go. I have to. So that's kind of the way this works when it comes to reasonable accommodation requests. So if you're an employer and someone comes to you, let's say with disability, right? Boss, I can't get the vaccine for COVID-19 because I have a disability where it can be very dangerous for me to get the vaccine. Or I have a disability where the vaccine won't work with my body. So what do you do in that situation? Again, look at the person's job and ask, well, how can you accommodate them? How can you change things around so that they can still work for you? They get their work done. They don't break the bank. They don't cost you too much money in accommodating them. And they're happy, you're happy, and they get to work without getting the vaccine, do their job functions, and everyone's happy, everyone's thrilled. If you can pull that off, great, try it. But if you're a restaurant and your executive chef is telling you that they're disabled and they can't get the vaccine, but they have to cook, you can't hybrid remote work, rather, you can't Zoom in and make a meal, right? You can't interact with the other chefs from another room behind plexiglass. So look at the type of job and ask yourself, if I accommodate this person, if I let them not get the vaccine and remote work, or maybe wear a mask, or stay in another part of the office, or work different hours from other people, is that going to hurt your bottom line financially, or hurt the way you function? Will it make it impossible for the company to run smoothly? So that's really the analysis. So if you can accommodate, go for it, do it. And the last thing I'll say on this is make sure that you have a right. I got a question before the show from an employer wanting to know, can I require proof of disability? Can I require proof of religious objection? And the short answer is yes, right? A lot of agencies and courts go back and forth on this point. It's a tricky one because if you get proof of someone's disability, keep in mind the HIPAA laws, you have to keep those medical records confidential. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, the takeaway here is that as a small employer, you can have mask mandates, you can have vaccine mandates. You want to be careful about how you enforce it. And you want to be careful not to penalize people, let's say, for not getting the vaccine if they can be working remotely and doing their job. So we have to take a break, and I realize this kind of dense, very detailed material. It's a bit complex, and it's also highly focused on certain legal terms. So could take a little break, let this all kind of sink in, let the audience chew on this for a while. I'm Eric Sauver, host of Employment Law Today. You're watching my show, Employment Law Today, here on Talk Radio NYC. When we come back, we'll have some more examples. We'll talk about the issue of safety in the workplace once again, and workers' compensation, and what you need to know. So stick around, folks. We'll be right back.
I'm Joseph Franklin McElroy, host of the new podcast, Gateway to the Smokies. It airs on talkradio.nyc every Tuesday night from 6 p.m. to 7. Every episode is dedicated to memorable experiences in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and surrounding areas. This show features experts and locals who expound upon the richness of culture, history, and adventure that awaits you in the Smokies. Tune in every Tuesday from 6 p.m. to 7 on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a cannabis enthusiast, a cannabis professional, or interested in entering the cannabis space? I'm Johnny Tsunami, and this is Planet Paco Lolo, a less taboo view. On our show, we will discuss the cannabis world through the perspective of various cannabis professionals. Tune in every Thursday evening, Eastern Standard Time, 6 p.m., Talk Radio NYC, Planet Paco Lolo, a less taboo view.
Are you passionate about the conversation around racism? Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. TLC, host of the Dismantle Racism Show, which airs every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc. Join me and my amazing guests as we discuss ways to uncover, dismantle, and eradicate racism. That's Thursdays at 11 o'clock a.m. on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a small business trying to navigate the COVID-19 related employment laws? Hello, I'm Eric Sauber, employment law, business law attorney, and host of the new radio show, Employment Law Today. On my show, we'll have guests to discuss the common employment law challenges business owners are facing during these trying times. Tune in on Tuesday evenings from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc, now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. I'm your host, Eric Sauber. Just to kind of summarize, we're having a topic here tonight of COVID considerations for employers, right? What you're allowed to do in terms of requiring your employees to get the vaccine for COVID-19 or to wear masks in the workplace. We're talking about what happens if an employee has an objection to getting a vaccine based on their religion, their disability, or even their pregnancy. And we're talking about what the federal and state laws have to say about what standards you as an employer must follow to keep your workplace safe for your employees and safe for your customers as well, your clients. And so I talked about the New York HERO Act, which, as I mentioned, basically requires employers to up their game, to have some more detailed, stringent plans for exemptions, and plans for safety against outbreaks of airborne infectious diseases such as COVID-19. Talked about what the plan looks like, how you distribute it to your employees, where you go to get guidance on this. You can go to New York State Department of Labor, and reach out to someone like myself, an employment law attorney, et cetera. But we're going to talk a little bit about, say, paid leave rules in a minute. But I want to cover one other issue, which is the President Biden's recent additions to the COVID-19 vaccination mandates for employers. All right, so some backdrop is that the federal government's been trying to pressure, really push people to get the vaccine, right? Pressure is the wrong word. They're trying to really, I think, encourage people to get vaccinated, and they see the importance of that for building herd immunity, for curbing the virus, and so forth. And so for a while, the government was saying to its own federal workers that if you're a federal employee or a federal contractor, you have to either get the vaccine for COVID-19 or submit to weekly testing, right? Okay, so now the government's saying if you're a federal employee, you have to get the vaccine, right? You can't just rely on the weekly testing aspect of, hey, I'll get a weekly COVID test, a PCR, I'll be negative, and we're good to go. I think the government's considering the fact that new variants coming out that are much more transmissible and can spread more quickly. And so a test might not show, somebody might catch the virus rather, after they got their COVID-19 test, which was negative. So basically now the government's saying, all right, now we're gonna branch out and tackle this issue that's been affecting private employers, right? Some private employers hate this. Some private employers actually are suing the Biden administration because they say, hey, it's my private business. I don't want you to tell me what to do. I don't want you to tell me that I have to have a vaccine requirement or a negative PCR test if you're a private business for a company with 100 employees or more, right? And so basically the federal government, President Biden issued an executive order and also worked with OSHA. Remember that OSHA is that federal agency that deals with occupational health and safety. And so now basically President Biden said, okay, OSHA, I want you to issue this emergency temporary standard, this basically issue a rule that says that an employer with 100 or more employees has to require that the employees either get the vaccine if they're coming into work, or weekly PCR COVID tests. And there could be some penalties, right? If you don't follow that, it could be $14,000 per violations. It could be penalties per employee as well. So it's important to know what to do if you're a business, say you're requiring a vaccine. So you can require employees to get the vaccine. You can require them to alternatively get weekly COVID-19 tests. And the same rules I mentioned before apply about exceptions, right? Employees that come to you, right? Your worker comes to you and says, I can't get the vaccine, I'm pregnant. I don't want to take a chance of this might cause a complication in my pregnancy. Or I'm disabled and this vaccine won't work for me, or it could even hurt me, right? Because of my condition. Or I have a religious objection where I can't get the vaccine. Same rules apply, right? You as a company look at several factors. You say, can they do their job with some accommodation, a change of location, change of hours, more protective gear, maybe a double mask and a face shield, maybe some gloves, physical social distancing. And if the person can safely do their job, right, get all their work done, meet their job duties, and it was not going to cost you a fortune, not going to break the bank, right? How much would it cost you to get them a couple extra masks maybe, and a face shield and some gloves or hand sanitizer? Not a lot. If they're, let's say, keeping records and keeping books, what's the harm to your company if they're doing it from home? Probably not a whole big difference. But if they're seeing clients live in person, if you run a massage or acupuncture location, practice rather, and you can't have your acupuncturist, doing anything off of Zoom, you can maybe perhaps say, no, I'm sorry, I can't grant that accommodation. If you want to try some other position at this company or different hours, maybe we can work that out. So the key is to know that you as an employer now, not only is that you can, not only are you allowed to ask for your workers to get vaccinated, but you have to either have that policy or have mandatory COVID-19 tests. So something that's important to know. Some questions that I've gotten around this include, right, what happens if an employer gets a request from someone who just says generally, I don't want to get the vaccine. But what if they don't point to any of those categories I talked about? What if it's not a religious objection, right? Person coming to you is, say, well-renowned, agnostic atheist, has zero spiritual ties or connections, has made that quite known. They're not saying that's the issue. They don't want to get the vaccine. They're not citing a disability, and they're not pregnant, right? Maybe it's a 35-year-old male employee, and they're not married. There's not a risk of their wife who's pregnant getting the illness. What do you do then, right? And the person says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to get this vaccine, but I can still do my job remotely, or I can still do my job from, say, another location, or if you give me extra PPE, protective gear, right? PPE. Well, here's where it gets tricky. Under the law, you're not required to accommodate just more generalized fears around COVID-19, right? Whether it's a generalized fear around the vaccine, sort of along the lines of you run a restaurant, you run a shop, you run an office, you run a marketing firm, whatever the case may be. You're getting your team back in the office 3 days a week. You have, say, John or Sally, they don't want to get the vaccine. And they just say, I read a lot of news on Twitter, and I'm afraid that, the government could be tracking me with this thing, or, my cousin, my friend had a cousin in Trinidad who had some bad reactions. I don't want to have that happen to me. If it's much more generalized fears, then you're not required to accommodate that by way of remote work or a different shift. But be careful though, because be careful in terms of what your employee is asking, what the reason they're giving is for not getting the vaccine, right? For coming to work without the vaccine. Because sometimes an employee can say to you, look, I have a lot of anxiety about this COVID-19 vaccine. I don't want to get it, but I want to keep my job. I don't want you to fire me. Well, a lot of anxiety could be a generalized fear, just a tension, a stress that many of us have around COVID-19, or it could be a very bona fide disability, right? They could have a severe anxiety disorder and it's manifesting around their fear of getting the COVID vaccine, or they could have PTSD related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is important if you're an employer, right? You're not supposed to play a psychiatrist or play a psychologist. That's not the takeaway here. The takeaway is that, if your employee objects to getting the vaccine and they ask for an accommodation, and you have more than 100 employees, you want to be very careful about teasing out what is their reason. Have them put their reason in writing to you. Take it back to your employment lawyers. Have them analyze it. And again, generalized fears don't mean accommodation, but a fear that's related to an anxiety disorder, it just might. So just really communicate with the employees. Talk to them, document issues. That's, I think, a key takeaway from this segment. All right, I will skip a little bit because time flies when I'm either with a guest or here by myself on my own, giving this presentation to my audience tonight. And I want to talk about this issue of workers' compensation and liability. It's a very interesting point. I think a lot of companies know you run a business, you have workers, you have hired W-2 employees, right? You get a workers' compensation policy and, it covers their injuries and they get hurt on the job. And that could be, a construction company or a physical labor job where there are a lot of injuries, or it could be, the secretary gets a paper cut or slips and falls in the office and, fractures her ankle, or gets hurt in some other way on the job. Workers' compensation will cover that claim. So I think a lot of companies are familiar with workers' compensation, but the question is, well, what happens if you have remote workers during COVID-19 and they're working remotely and they get injured at their home office? Who has to pay? Stick around. I'm going to answer that question in a moment, right here on Employment Law Today on Talk Radio NYC. Be right back.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the nonprofit sector connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on talkradio.nyc, I host a program, Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on talkradio.nyc.
Do you feel uninformed about menopause and how it impacts on your life? Hi, I'm Pat Duckworth, women's health strategist and host of the Hot Women Rock radio show, empowering women leaders at menopause. Join me every Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. UK time on talkradio.nyc for interviews with inspirational women who will share their top tips to rock your world.
Have you ever thought of reinventing yourself? Are you looking to create a new life's journey? Hi, I'm Kevin Barbaro, host of Coffee Talk XL every Tuesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc. Tune in live to hear me and my guests from a variety of different backgrounds. As a former college coach and a current full-time actor and owner of multiple companies, my show is as eclectic as my life. That's Coffee Talk XL every Tuesday night, 8 p.m. on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to Employment Law Today. All right, I'm Eric Sauver. I'm still the host of the show, and here on Talk Radio NYC every Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. I'm also an employment law and business law attorney, and so I'm talking tonight about our topic, which is COVID considerations for employers. What you need to know about everything from mask mandates in the workplace and vaccination requirements to your rights as an employer when it comes to letting people go. We're talking about safety protocols that you have to follow, things like the New York HERO Act that requires certain safety plans for preventing the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace, and basically issues along those lines. So one of our viewers wrote in, let's see if I can find my question here, about workers' compensation. about whether or not an employee who's working remotely or who gets COVID-19 can be eligible for workers' compensation benefits. So let's break this down into two questions. One question, you are an employer. In the last year and a half, you've had all your employees remote because of this terrible virus. You've been holding meetings on Zoom, you've been holding meetings on Google Chat and WebEx and et cetera, and you decide to keep your workers remote, or maybe a hybrid remote part in person. So when an employee gets injured, right? Maybe they tripped over some computer wires and broke their arm. And maybe they're in their own apartment down in Chelsea. They're not in your office. Maybe they're in their home. Are they entitled to collect workers' compensation from your company? And I've heard some different people guess on this. And surprisingly, the answer is actually, it could be a yes with some caveats. So let's just start with workers' compensation. Again, New York is one of the few states that requires you as an employer to obtain workers' compensation insurance, again, to cover your workers if they get hurt or injured on the job, right? So that includes, say, safety issues where an employee might catch a certain illness where they caught it on the job and they can prove that, which I'll get to in a moment. But again, workers' compensation, it covers an injury, and it actually spares you as an employer from very expensive litigation, possibly from negligence lawsuits, because you're basically paying for parts of the salary and not for all the pain and suffering and the attorney's fees and so forth, or a court case. But if you're an employer and you have your employees working remotely, if you required them to be remote during the pandemic, then the way the law looks at it is as this. Their work from home is a de facto office. It's like an unofficial office setting, right? Because here's the thing, before COVID, if you have an employee who maybe decided, hey, I live out in Suffolk County, I'm gonna come in twice, I'm gonna work from home once or twice a week if that's okay. And you said, okay, sure, Tom, that's fine. Or okay, Mary, you can come in, Monday through Thursday, work from home Friday, we can swing that. That person would be working from home and trip over a wire on their computer, right, and break their arm. Arguably, it's not on you as the employer, because you didn't force them to set up a home office. They could have come in, they asked to go to work from home. But if you're forcing them to work from home, and maybe they have to get certain equipment, maybe they have to be around certain cables or wires to connect to the internet more quickly, maybe they need a certain microphone for Zoom calls with wires around, or maybe they just need to be home more often, then you're creating a workplace in which they're at. So if your employee if you get a call, they broke their shoulder at home, again, still have the same issues of proof, right? Proving that it happened on the job, not when they came in from a party at 1 a.m., right? If they had a police report that they went to the hospital at 1 a.m. on a Friday night and broke their shoulder, they probably weren't doing work for you on the clock, especially if they're working in, say, finance or architecture or law. So they still have to prove that they got the injury on the job while in the course of work, and didn't get it taking a break, walking outside down the street or riding their bicycle. But the issue with COVID-19 is that there's a challenge in terms of causation, right? If somebody hurts themselves either at your workplace or remotely in the case of the pandemic, if they get hurt, usually there's a cause and effect. So let's go back to the question of, let's say you have your workers back in the office, back in the plant, back in the restaurant. Suppose a COVID-19 outbreak happens and they catch COVID-19. Is that a workplace injury? And if it is, can they sue you under workers' compensation laws? And the courts have been finding that in fact the employees can file workers' compensation claims. They still have to prove that they got the sickness, the COVID-19 illness from work, from your office, from your plant, from your factory, wherever you're located. But it's a challenge of causation, because we all know this is a highly contagious, highly infectious disease, and it's not as clear cut. Let's say if someone's working at your office, or carrying some heavy boxes to the conference room and they trip and they hurt their back, or let's say they're working in a kitchen, they get burned on the grill, right? So causation remains an issue, but you could be liable for someone catching COVID-19. In fact, there have been some court cases where people got very, very sick and died, and if the company didn't have a safety plan and follow a certain standard of care, there could be even a wrongful death suit. So my takeaway here, folks, is that know that you may have to have the workers' compensation policies for your remote workers if you're requiring them to be remote. And with this virus, again, if the Delta variant kicks up, if there's a mandatory, let's say, order from the state or the city or the government that people have to be working remotely, if you as a company are mandating that, you should have a workers' compensation policy updated to cover that. It's an interesting issue too, because it dovetails nicely into, right, the safety protocols that you keep under OSHA, right, the federal guidelines to say, hey, you have to have a safe workplace. So if you want to help prevent the outbreak, one takeaway is to follow the safety guidance from the CDC and OSHA and your state and local health officials, all things like that you can take a look at if you're an employer. So takeaways here again, that you have liability if you're an employer. Keep in mind that remote employees are still employees, right? They don't suddenly become freelance or independent contractors just because they're working in a different location. If they have the same hours, if they can only work for you, if they have to work 40 hours a week, if you train them, provide them with a laptop, then you might still very well keep in mind, you might still have employees and not necessarily freelancers. I see a lot of companies making mistakes in the pandemic. They have their workers doing the exact same duties and tasks and jobs, and they're under the same tight scrutiny, and they're following the office and the employer's rules and regulations, but they're working remotely. And so employers start to say, okay, now you're a freelancer, now I can pay you with 1099. That's not the case. So I think some important takeaways here, once again, is that liability as an employer, can be significant with this virus. So if you have questions around your employees coming back to the office, coming back to the plant, make sure you talk to an employment law attorney and someone like myself that can help you to sort through what you're required to do. So we're talking about liability, talking about state mandates for masks and vaccinations, talking about what you as an employer can do. We talked about the HERO Act and safety protocol for having a plan in the workplace to protect your workers from infectious airborne diseases. I think I'll cover maybe a few takeaways at the end of the show. What can you take away as an employer? What are some best practices here with respect to COVID-19? So I'm going to read them off to you, or just sort of rattle them off, if I may. I think one important takeaway from tonight's show, one COVID consideration for employers. If you want to reduce your risk of liability for COVID-19, folks, you really want to follow or even exceed certain CDC standards for things like hygiene, like safety, sanitation, health. Get a look at the CDC standards, get a look at the industry standards. You also want to make sure that you follow OSHA and any New York State procedures for workplace safety as well. You want to make sure you follow all the rules with employees in the workplace around things like social distancing, or switching to mobile apps for orders, or having hand sanitizing stations, right? You want to educate employees about prevention and safe practices. And you want to display warning signs for customers to follow CDC guidelines and have warnings on how to handle, let's say, hostile customers, like who won't take your direction around wearing a mask. You as an employer also want to develop certain policies around either a mask mandate or a COVID-19 vaccination mandate. And you want to make sure that you're keeping any requests for accommodations based on disability very confidential, very private, right? That you're not disclosing if somebody catches COVID-19. You don't want to tell the rest of the workforce, hey, John got COVID, so everyone stay home and get tested. You can say an employee has been diagnosed with COVID-19, but you don't want to reveal someone's private medical information. And these are mistakes I've seen employers make. They tell their customers and other employees, hey, Susan got sick with COVID-19, so we're all not going to come in next week. So just some things to keep in mind. I think again, like tonight's show is not meant to, give you a table to memorize of all the different rules. In effect, I couldn't remember all these rules, and I do this every day. I need to research and go back and look at guidance. It's really meant to just to keep you in the loop, to understand as an employer that the main COVID issues I'm seeing as an employment law attorney are questions around what you can require your employees to do, questions around like what you have to do in terms of hiring people back or making accommodations based on disability and so forth. So, and also there you have to keep in mind that you might have certain requirements in the workers' compensation. So I hope that covers a hot topic of the day. I have about 30, 40 seconds left in the show tonight. And I'll say, I so enjoy doing this show every week for my listeners. I hope you got something from this. If you have any questions, you can reach me, Eric Sauver, attorney at the law offices of Eric M. Sauver. And my email address is EMS, that's Eric Mitchell Sauver, EMS at sauverlawfirm.com, SARVERLAW firm.com. Or you can call me at 917-930-8684. You can also reach my website, www.sauver, that's S as in Sam, AR, V as in Victor, ER, -law.com. And I'm happy to answer your questions. And next week, join me for another fascinating guest here on Employment Law Today. Thank you all. Have a great evening.